In Project 5, we're going to take a look at the absolute and mixed cell references in formulas. And again, the only reason that these become important is when we start copying formulas from one cell to another. And previously, when we've copied copied formulas from one cell to another, we've wanted the cell references to change relative to whatever column or row that we were in. In the following examples, especially in Project 5, we're going to be looking at items that when we copy, we don't want certain cells within that formula to change as it copies. So you can read the difference there on page 57 between relative cell references and absolute cell references. And then added to that is mixed cell references, and with that you have a combination of rows and columns being either relative or absolute. So we're going to begin with Project 5A, looking at the file called CCR Reports. I've already pulled that up and saved it as they've asked us to, shown at the bottom of page 57. And you'll see in the first area there customers who have planned sales, and we're going to determine what the actual sales are based on the percent of increase or decrease that's found in cell B12. And with their particular example, they're using the 1.1 to be 110%, so it's taking the value in each one of these planned sales and multiplying that by 110%. And what that does is it'll take 10% of the planned sales and add that to these sales in the column B. And that's a little bit different than what you may be used to. And I'll show you a difference in how you could set that formula up as well. So we'll do what the book has first, and then I'll show you an alternative way to do it. But essentially what we're wanting to do in the actual column is take the planned sales, multiply that times the percentage that's located in cell B12. So we'll start out the formula with an equal sign, click in the planned sales cell, which is a B3. We're going to multiply that by the amount that's in cell B12. Now this is what we've done in the past. Essentially just put in the formula, we press enter, gives us the amount, which essentially it's taking 34,000 times 10% and adding it back to it. Okay. If we autofill down, notice you're going to see some problems here. And I want you to see the formula is the first one that has a 0 in it. If you look at it, B4, which is correct for the next line, B4 times B13. It moved relative to whatever row it was in. And as it moved down, it went to B13, which there's no value or number in cell B13, so that's why we're getting a 0. So it's taking B4 times 0, which would be a 0. And same thing down here, if you look at B7, which B7 is correct, we want the B7 for the planned sales, but it's multiplying it times B16. Well, in this case, B16 has text in it, and that's why it's giving us a value here. You can see the trace error button allows you to go in and get help on the error, ignore the error, whatever you need to do. But my point here is when it auto-filled down, when we autofilled or copied it down, the first part of the formula, watch the B3, B4, B5, we want that to change as it copies down, but we do not want the increase-decrease cell to change as it copies down. So what we're going to do is make B12 an absolute cell reference. And making cells absolute, you simply add a $sign in front of the column letter and in front of the row number. So we're going to edit this formula. Still the same formula, but we're going to edit it because of how it copies. So I'm going to click in front of the B and add a $sign, and then I'm going to click in front or move in front of the 12 and add another $sign. And that makes this an absolute cell reference. And the way I remember is when you copy to other cell locations, it absolutely will not change as it's being copied. So go ahead and press enter. Still gives you the same amount, obviously, for that first cell, that first formula. Now when we autofill down, notice we get true numbers. And I want us to take a look at the next formula here. It changes to B4, which is true. We want it to change relative to whatever row it is for the planned sales. But B12, notice as I arrow down, B12 never changes. Okay, but notice the rows for the planned sales are changing, representing the cells that those numbers are in. Okay, so that's an absolute cell reference. Now the beauty in this again is if you want to do some what if analysis. You can say, okay, what if the sales go down by 10%? If that's the case, then it's going to be 0.9. And you can see immediately the changes that are there. Okay. Now another alternative to this, let me show you a formula that if we want to see what 10% is, okay, when you put in just 10% or 10%, this is 10% of what the actual sales are. So if your amount is 10% in here, not 110%, but just 10%, then we'd have to modify the formula by taking planned sales times your percentage and then adding back the planned sales. Okay, we come up with the same number that we had before. It's just adding the interest or adding the increase to the original sales. So either one of those formulas is fine. One is including and adding the 100% to it, taking that into account. The other one's kind of using the raw number. So however you feel most comfortable with understanding that, feel free to use it. Now a little bit further down here in the employee training, we're going to determine what the weighted average is for each one of these employees. And I'm going to start out in E17, but if you can see here, each one of these employees, their training, whether it's in plumbing, electrical, or carpentry, gets different weights applied to it. And before I go, we need to add the averages here, or calculate the averages. The averages for plumbing, 76%, and I'm just going to fill these across so we have some averages in there. The weighted average, though, will take the plumbing amounts, multiply that times the weight, then we'll add the electrical percentage, multiply that times the weight, and carpentry, multiply that times the weight, and you'll add each one of those components together to get the weighted average. So this is going to be kind of a lengthy formula, but all formulas start out with an equal sign. Take the plumbing times its weight, 20%, and then we're going to add the electrical times its weight and add. And then the carpentry, I can't really see that. I can't point and click on it, but I know it's D17. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in, D17, multiplied times the weight. Okay. Go ahead and press enter. And that gives me 81.2%. We'll go back and format these in just a minute. Make sure I've got those right. B17, B24, C17, C24. Okay, I think we're good on that. Now, and these numbers won't match the book just yet because we've got to make some changes to the weights a little bit later on. But what I want to show you here, all these employees have the same formula. They're taking their percentages times the training weights, percentages, training weights. So you'd think we could autofill it down. When you do, again, you're going to get some errors there. But as we autofill down, remember, when we go line by line, we want these percentages to change relative to what row it's in, right? We want it to go B18, B19, B20, okay, on each of those, and that's correct. But the numbers or the cell references for the training weights, notice those changing as I go down. They're going 25, which there's nothing in B25. There's nothing in C25. So those particular cells need to be absolute so that when we copy them down, they absolutely will not change to B25, B26, and so forth. So again, we're just going to place dollar signs back into the original formula. Dollar signs around the cells that we want to keep consistent. Still get the same number, but when we autofill down this time, they should look more like percentages. Okay, I'm going to decrease the numbers here. Okay, so again, as you look at any of these, the numbers representing the actual percentages for each employee should change as they go down, but the training weight should not change as you're filling those down. And then again, they're making some changes to some of the training weights so that you can see immediately how it affects the weighted average. Again, these are what if analysis. So what if the training weights for the plumbing go up to 30%? Notice how that changes the weighted average for each of them. Carpentry, if it goes down to 40%, again, notice how it changes immediately the weighted average for each of the employees. Okay, I'm going to save that again. The next area, the next activity, Project 5C, takes a look at payrolls. And we're going to look at absolute and mixed cell references, not necessarily in this one, but in our simple interest loan table. But it's all in Project 5, and then 5C is still looking at absolute cell references, and 5D looks at the mixed cell references. So let's look at the weekly payroll. To determine gross salary, you would take your hourly wage and multiply that how many hours you work, and then if you had overtime, you would still take your hourly wage times the overtime amount, which is time and a half, times how many hours that you have with overtime. So you take your hourly wage times your hours plus hourly wage times overtime times the overtime amount. So we're going to put that formula in the gross area. Again, we're going to start out with an equal sign. Take hourly wage times the number of hours, and then we'll add, same thing, hourly wage times the amount, which is time and a half, times 2 hours. Okay? And get 2,365 for that one. And again, we're going to be looking at, when we autofill down, we're going to have to make some changes in the absolute cell referencing. Now, autofill down, you're going to see some errors here. But when we autofill down, again, these amounts, the B9, B29, B30, those should change relative to whatever employee we're looking at. But the overtime amount, that needs to be held constant and made absolute. So to make those absolute, we'll go back to the original formula. And the B36 is the one that we want to keep absolute. So I'm just going to put dollar signs in front of each one of those, the column reference and the row number. And then I'll press enter. And we'll go ahead and autofill down. And again, notice as we copy down, the hours and the overtime, those should be changing as they move down. It's the only thing that we don't want to change is the overtime cell. So that should have an absolute cell reference around it. Next, we're going to take a look at the withholding tax. Notice the withholding tax rate is 28%, and essentially what we're going to do with that is take the gross amount and multiply it times the percent. Again, we're going to need to keep that constant as it copies down, so we can make that adjustment as we build the formula. So we're going to start with an equal sign, click on the gross amount, and then we're going to multiply that by the withholding rate. I want to show a trick to you too. If you press the F4, the function key at the top of your keyboard, notice that it automatically puts dollar signs around that cell reference. And actually, if you hit pressing F4, it removes the one on the column, keeps the one on the row. If you press it again, it puts it on the column, not on the row, and then again it takes it back to relative cell referencing. So I'm just pressing the F4 key to kind of toggle through those. Okay? And if you can't remember that, you just put a dollar sign in front of the column and the row number. I'm going to press enter. That gives us $662.20. Now go ahead and autofill that down. Notice we're good here because as we've put the absolute cell reference, the E36 has not changed as it copies down. Same thing with Social Security tax. We're going to take the gross amount times the rate, which is an H36. I'm pressing F4 to get my dollar signs around there, and then enter. Okay, and then your net amount, which you actually bring home, would be your gross minus your withholding minus the Social Security tax. And none of these need to be absolute because they're going to be changing as they fill down. Okay, so that's some more examples of using absolute cell references. And then the last one, project 5D, we're going to take a look at mixed cell references. And if you'll notice below the simple interest loan table, we're going to determine what the amounts are based on principal and interest rates. So for example, in this table you're going to see for the actual amount we want to take 1,000 times 5%, and that'll give us $50, and we can autofill that across and hopefully then autofill it down if we have the formula set up correctly. Okay, so we're going to start in cell B41, and we'll start the formula with an equal sign and multiply it times the loan amount, or the actual amount there, times your percentage. Now I'm not going to do anything with it yet. I'm just going to press enter, and we're going to autofill across. I'll widen these a little bit. Woo. Okay, now notice what happens here when we go across. We go to C41. It takes C40, which if you look at C40, that's correct, but then it multiplies it times B41. It's moving to the right relative to whatever column it's in. Next we've got D40, which is okay. D40, we want that, but now it's taken C41. So we want to hold that column constant when it copies to the right. Okay, let me undo what we've done here so far. So as it copies across, we want it to hold. What do we want it to hold? Okay, we want it to hold the A41, the A part. So when it copies across, we don't want it to change to B and C. Okay, so we're going to change that just right there. That's the only thing that we want to hold constant is the A. We'll see if that fixes our problem. Looks different, hopefully it's right, but if we look at each of these, it's C40, which is your 2,000 times A41. D40, which is 3,000 times A41. So that seems to be working okay. Now, if we autofill down, got some problems here, but let's look at what it's doing. If you go back to your formula, this should be B39, so the numbers changed, right? Those rows changed as it went down. Also, as it went down, it went to A42, which is correct. We want it to move down A42, A43. So the only thing that's wrong there is the row 40. We want to keep that constant as it copies down. So let's try this again. Now notice here we've put dollar signs in front of the row 40 and dollar sign in front of the A. This is a little bit more complex because we're trying to autofill across and down. So let's try this again. We're going to autofill across, which should work fine because we made a change to the A41. But now when we autofill down, we should get some correct numbers. And let's just randomly click on one of these. For this one, it should be C40 times A46. Another random one, E40 times A49. So these are examples of mixed cell references because if it were absolute, it would have dollar signs in front of the column and the row, and if it were relative, you wouldn't have any dollar signs at all. So that's an example of mixed cell references. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this again. And that concludes Chapter 2. Take a look at the chapter summary. Also, the concepts check are back there. I want to review those. And then finally, do the assessments at the end of the chapter. And as I mentioned in Chapter 1, these are not to be turned in or submitted. I will post the answers to the assessments in the middle of the week. So you can take a look at that and kind of double check your answers, but you do not need to submit those. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to email me or call me.